Morning for us out here in the West. Thank you all for joining. Today's meeting is obviously focused on the Arizona Access's EVV, Electronic Visit Verification programs, alternate EVV system requirements, and business rules. Today is a follow-on to the conversation that we had about a week and a half ago that gave the overview. Today is intended to be a deep dive, more interactive session where we have the opportunity to have a little more discussion and to really get into some of the questions that you and your colleagues may have. If we go to the next slide, we'll do a little bit of housekeeping here before we want to jump right on in. So we do have a large contingent of folks out there on the line, and that's a good thing. Thank you all again for joining. But to make sure that we can go through and everybody can hear the questions and the answers, we're going to keep everybody default muted until such time as they have a question. Just as with the last sessions, if you have a question that's coming up that you want to make sure gets addressed, the best way to do that is going to be asking it through the chat function of the meeting here today. And that's the little speech box in the little Teams menu that pops up down at the bottom of your screen. If you have a question that you'd like to ask in person without going through the chat, in the participants list, you also have the ability to raise your hand. Both Ruth, Andrea, and myself will be monitoring throughout the course of our conversations today to make sure that we get everyone who has a question and do our best to answer them. As always, we also have our colleagues from the state, from Arizona, there on the line in case there are policy questions or clarifications that we need. So the goal here today is for us to be able to really walk through the alt-EVV specification, the Arizona Access specific addendum to that specification, understand how it works, and really answer questions and give you feedback based on the concerns and open questions that you may have. So at this point, I want to make sure that everyone's clear that, first off, we're going to answer as many questions as we can today. We want to open this up and we want to get a lot of feedback, but we know that we may not be able to get to every question. So any questions that are posed either in the chat or in the discussion today that we aren't able to get to in the course of our presentation, we will be capturing, and those will go up with responses out on the question and answer FAQ that the state has published for their EVV program. So even if you don't get your question answered today, we will be capturing it and make sure it does get answered as we go forward. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to John Kalivas. John is the Senior Director of our Solutions and Configuration. And he's going to be walking through the agenda general areas. A little bit of feedback there. All right, sorry about that. And John will be going through and reviewing and really starting to answer the questions. We wanted to try and put a general structure around this so that we can make sure that if folks have the similar questions to one another, that we can cover them all in the same area so that we're not jumping around, and that you can really have all of your considerations and questions answered as we go. So with that, I will turn it over to John.
Good morning, everyone, and thanks, Tim, for that introduction. As Tim mentioned, we're going to go through the specs today. A little structure to it, but a little less unstructured. What we want and what we received feedback from the initial call was that we want to get into the technical details and the specifications themselves, how they relate, and how that applies to me as a vendor, as an alternate EVV vendor, as I'm writing the code to integrate with the state program. So what I want to start with is the general spec. We're going to do a quick review. After each section that we go through, I'm going to pause and ask for questions. As Tim mentioned, put your questions in the chat function if you want to get them answered early and now. I'm going structured because I'm going to try to eliminate bouncing between specs or up and down between sections. We will start with the client section, which is the members. We will move to employees or the care workers in the field that are going to provide the service to our recipients. And then we're going to talk about visits. What is a visit? How do I collect a visit? What are the needs of that visit? For the Arizona program, there are a few changes. So some of the vendors here that are participating today may be participating in other programs. There are a couple variances that need to be applied to Arizona as they design the program. They're trying to collect a little bit more data than many of the other programs may collect. So we will point out those differences as we go forward. So first of all, I just want to start with just a general reset from last time. The team went through the general specifications and the addendum. So just to restate, the general spec is the universe for SAN data. This includes every possible data field we could collect. It provides a definition of what that field looks like from a database perspective. And then it provides, if it's a required field, an optional field, a conditional field, or maybe a field that we may or may not use for your program. In this case, when we say optional, we don't mean don't send a field. Optional does mean that if you have this information in your database or it's collected in your system, the Arizona State program wants that information. Optional just means if based on the type of collection you don't have that information, you have the ability to pass a null. But again, just want to restate and stress, we want to receive the information if it's been collected in any of the source systems for the state program. So we're going to scroll down just a little bit into here, and I just want to point out a couple of things. From an overview perspective and a field perspective, as I mentioned in the opening, this is the universe. For SAN data, this is everything that we can do based on frequency, limits, what the rejection process looks like, what the new records look like, and the transmission methods. I recommend that your technical teams review this because it provides good detail on how to interact with the SAN data system, how you will receive acknowledgments and error messages, and how you will know if a particular transaction or visit or member or client has passed and been accepted by the system. When we get to the field level information, I recommend that you use the addendum. The addendum is identifying the fields that are in play for a particular program, and in this case, it's Arizona. So if there are items that are listed in the general specification that don't appear in the addendum, that section or segment, as it's called in the general specification, is not required. I saw there was some noting, a question that was posed around client payer information in the client payload. We're actually going to receive the payer information in the visit and not at the client level, so that information is not needed at the client or the member level. And at the bottom there is an appendix. The appendix gives a couple of technical comparisons and examples. It provides a response and request simulated and just gives a general idea to your development teams on how the interaction will work as we go forward. As we get into testing, you will receive additional guidance and help. So don't think this is the only time that you're going to receive this type of information or help. So pause there from an opening perspective. In general, are there basic general questions from anybody on the phone that they want to answer? Structure, transaction frequencies, things of that nature. Any questions around those? And I'm watching chat as well. Good morning, Leslie. We'll get to contingency plan, as Ruth said, when we get to that section in the visit.
General question?
Absolutely, go ahead.
So this particular document, I didn't see this one on the website. I saw the 7.6. It looks different, the first page. The one I saw on the website was just AHCCCS alternate EVV vendor 7.6. So is this document also available on the website?
So this one is the addendum. Is it this one?
That's the one. That's the one
yep.
that I pulled off the website.
Yep. So this is the addendum. This is the state-specific field-level definition on what's required to be sent. The other one...
the other one, is that, can we also get that off the website?
It should be available, and I'm just going to defer. Ruth and Andrea, did we post this, the general spec, out there as well? I believe we did.
Okay, I can look for it today, thank you.
Okay. And again, just for guidance, the general spec gives the universe, but does provide how we interact with the SAN data system. The addendum, or this file will flip over, provides the state-specific definition that aligns to that general specification. So as you code to the specific sections, client, employee, and visit, please use the addendum to drive what you're going to pass us and not the general spec. Any other general questions at this point?
I have a question. I have version 1.6 of the addendum. When did version 1.8 get published? And will we receive notifications when there's a change to the? Because these, like you said, these are the universe documents. This is what we need to be looking at from both the master spec and the addendum. Is there some notification process that I need to sign up for when there's a version change?
Andrea, Ruth, I'll have to defer to that one on you from a notification perspective. From a content perspective, there were some cosmetic changes, some wordsmithing, and some updates, a few cleanup type activities. It didn't fundamentally change any of the data definitions or the fields that we're expecting, but it was a cleanup activity that occurred for 1.8.
And so we'll verify with the state that they have posted the latest addendum, and just make sure. And they have a listserv that they are sending this communication on. So if you're on that, you probably would get the notifications.
Yep. And Dara, thanks for posting that update as well.
I believe I am signed up for the notifications. Just like I was invited to this, or I got the notification for this. I don't remember seeing that. Last question. On the addendum, do you specify in an overview section what you changed? Because I understand you said it was cosmetic and some housekeeping things, but we have to read the whole document to try and determine what changed. So okay.
We removed these two service codes and we added back in a service code were the two changes that we did.
Okay.
So on page 2, there's a version history, and it'll tell you specifically what changed from version to version. So that you don't have to read the entire document. It's just the service codes that were in play at this point.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Other questions? Just general questions, and then we're going to dive in. So starting on page 4 is our table of contents. At the top of page 6 is where the addendum itself starts. We've pulled out some of the generic items that are specific to the state program, and this provides a general overview and some guidelines on how we transmit data. So as we mentioned in the last call, intended for the technical teams and the project managers, basically the vendors that support the collection of electronic visit records on behalf of your provider agencies in the field. Transmission method is JSON. SAN Data has created a RESTful web service that sits out there. That listener is available 24/7 at any time. Each endpoint, so client, member, and visit, are its own URL. Those will be provided with you in your testing instructions. So that we're calling for client, we're calling specifically for employee, and then we're calling specifically for visit. We separate those out so that we can apply what we call validation logic. The validation logic says, did I adhere to the specification? Is my member ID the same length as what the state is providing? Is my date formatted in the right, is the date formatted correctly for the particular response? Is the service code within the list that's provided? So it does that type of validation. And then there's a second entry to that. The second piece of it is actually writing the data to the system. And that writes into the individual provider agency accounts and applies the business logic to that validation. So do I have a valid member? Did it match the member ID that was provided in the state inbound file? Is one example of that. There's a couple of transaction limit sizes that we enforce, and this is just from a speed perspective. So we don't want your service to hang out there for long periods of time, or you have to code in pauses that are waiting for databases to be updated or exception logic to be applied. So we're putting a 5,000 count maximum on the size of the transactions that you can send. We recommend that you send as many as you can in an individual batch, or you may prefer to send it more frequently. So I've had others move towards a more frequent transaction to keep speed as their primary goal, passing all the clients, then all the employees, and then just worry about the visit data that aligns to those clients and employees. We'll get into how that matching logic works when we get to the visit information. The data format section is just a format, so it gives you general guidelines on what SAN data believes the data types are. We know that some people apply different logic and word them differently from a data type perspective, and we're just giving you a few examples of how that applies to the SAN data system and specification. You'll note that there's a lot of columns that are in string value. We do that so that we can capture, say, alphanumeric in a field, as opposed to trying to write some logic around it. We consume it as a string value. So those that are technical on the phone will apply sub-logic to the string to ensure that it adheres. So if it's alphanumeric, no special characters, we'll check for special characters and may kick that field out if we do get there. Then we talk about the rejection process. So from a rejection process perspective, it's a two-step transaction. First, you send the transaction, you receive back an acknowledgement and a transaction ID. At that point, we ask you to pause your code to allow the database to catch up and process the records. And then you send us the transaction ID through a endpoint, and it will return you the status of that batch, along with any error message that occurred for any records that may have failed. The error messages themselves are string value. The SAN data team is working on a error message file that we will send out as soon as it's been approved. We did some work earlier this week to get it formatted correctly so it's easy to ingest. But each of those error messages will be provided so that you can operationalize and send out the information. You know whether it's a correction to a visit, a correction that needs to be completed by the provider agency, or potentially something you can modify in your system to correct that error message. We'll get into that a little bit more as we individually work with each of the groups to onboard so you can code your system based on how you architect or how your system flows and captures the information.
Hey, Joan, it's Ruth. Just really quick, before we get too far, I've seen at least 5 or 6 questions related to the frequency required by policy. So the frequency and then the type of data that they're supposed to be sending. I think we had a section on frequency a little bit earlier. Yep, right there. So scope of data, what we're looking for is those completed visits only. And then the frequency, our transmission method allows for kind of real-time updates, but the state is requiring at least daily for these visits.
Thanks, Ruth. And did that help? I'm trying to scroll back to the chat to see who answered that or asked that question.
Yeah, I think we got one from Rick, another one from VTrack for EVV, and then another similar question from Emily as well.
Yep. So let's expand a little bit on that because we get multiple questions there. So from a frequency perspective, because we are engaging and we're trying to be CURES compliant, and CURES compliant includes the step for claims validation. Claims validation means I have electronic visit data captured that aligns to the dates, times, and service code that I have created a claim or a bill for that I'm being reimbursed for. So we want to ensure that the state accounts, so all of the agencies that are collecting electronic visits are as up to date as possible. My recommendation is that you send files today that are completed visits from yesterday today, and it allows your system to catch up and apply any of the manual updates or edits that the provider agencies have done in the field to those visits, and we know that they're in a quote-unquote completed status. What completed status means is that I have all of the cures elements collected at a minimum, but I've also applied the logic that the program is looking for from an adherence perspective. We'll get to this, but contingency plan, how scheduling applies, etc., that I have all of the information captured so I can successfully send that visit record over into the state's aggregator system for collection and reporting. Pause there. Stephen will get to schedules momentarily. So good question. We'll hold that one for a second. Any other questions, Ruth, from a frequency perspective that you saw?
Just kind of a common theme here is, when do they need to send the schedules? Is it after the clock in and clock out has occurred?
Yep. Schedules, as I mentioned, we'll talk about that when we get to visit, but scheduling information is flowed or collected along with the visit. We're not trying to make you clock in exactly at the scheduled time and clock out exactly at the scheduled time. We're looking for trends. So if I schedule the visit to occur at 9 a.m., did I start at 9:15, 9:30, 8:45? And the schedule doesn't have to specifically align to the time clock in and clock out time. Again, we're looking for trends from a program perspective. How close are we to scheduling our caregivers in the field to align to the visits that they're collecting? We know things happen, right? Individuals have family emergencies, things come up. So we're just looking for, at the time of that visit, what was the scheduled start time and what was the scheduled end time. And I'll show you where those fit into when we get to the visit information.
And John, we do have one guest named Mike raising his hand, so I will go ahead and Mike, you can unmute yourself and ask the question.
Good morning, Mike. Are you there?
Hello. Can you hear me?
I can hear you now.
Yeah, I'm sorry. This is
worries.
Mike. So, yeah, I have a question related to visit. Can I ask it now?
Yeah, go ahead.
So, when the schedule is checked in and if the checkout is not performed by the clinician, if they miss the clock out, is there a limit, like within 24 hours we need to send that schedule to SANData, or it can be sent whenever the checkout is done by the office staff on the next day?
It can be sent once the check-in has been corrected. So from a workflow perspective, we know that, right, most of the time your visits are collected day one, day two, your administrative staff may go in and do updates and edits to those visits. So in that case, on day one, it wouldn't be a completed visit until that clock out time was collected. So you'd potentially send that on day two or day three, depending on when it got to that completed status.
Okay. So we can send in-progress schedules as well, you're saying?
You could, yep. So if you want to do multi-steps, you could do an incomplete visit where you had a schedule and you had a clock in and no clock out, and then the following day you could send the same visit with the corrected information, and we would update that record to match your system.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you. I have one more question. I'm going to send that in the chat.
Okay.
So if you can look into it on the overnight schedules, how to send it.
So that's a great question. Does your system cut off at midnight and restart at 12:01?
Yeah, when there is an overnight schedule, like clinician will be visiting the patient once during the night, and then they check out in the morning. So how SANData is expecting, how the state is expecting to send that to SANData in that particular case?
So do you bill for that record? Do you generate a claim for that record with the overnight span and do a start date of the 15th and an end date of the 16th in your example?
Yes.
So then from a SAN data claims perspective, we look at start date and end date, collect all visits for that client, who's the member, the employee, and the provider agency for that service code, and we sum together those two to get to total units. So as long as you're span date billing, you can send it in 2 records. We'll store it in 2 records, and we will count those 2 records as one to match to one claim, if that makes sense.
Just to confirm one more time, like if there is a schedule from 9 p.m. to 9 a.m., we can, it's planned for 7:15. So we can send as 2 separate schedules on 7:15, 9 p.m. to 11:59 or 12 a.m. and on 7:16, 12 a.m. to 9 a.m. Can we send it like that?
Yep, absolutely.
In this case, is there a requirement to have the clinician perform the checkout for 7:15 and check-in for 7:16 at 12 a.m.?
Depends on how your system works. So we don't want to add complexity into your system. Does it automatically stop at 12:59 and create the secondary record on your side?
No, the system will not stop that. If the checkout time is after 12 a.m., when the checkout is entered, it's automatically going to split it into 2 separate line items. I mean, for each different date.
Yep, and that's totally fine. So in the SAN data system, we do continuous visits, and we don't split our time. So we would record it the visit starting 7:15, and we would have 9 o'clock as the end time, and the start date of that visit would be 7:15 and run for the duration. If you send yours in 2 visits, that's completely acceptable. On the scheduling side, you could split the schedule so that only the scheduling times appear to match the visit, or you could actually send a schedule that this was a 9 p.m. to 9 a.m. on both of those visits, so that from a state perspective, they could see that this was an overnight visit that occurred in 2 based on the alternate EDV system.
So you're saying we can send the same start time and end time, 9 p.m. to 9 a.m. on both the days, 7:15 and 7:16?
In the visit time in, or the scheduled time in and time out? Yes, you can.
So is there, like, we have a date and time separately for check-in and check-out? Like, we can send a check-in with the date and check-out with the date separately, so you can recognize it as overnight?
Yep. So we have check-in time, check-out time, both system generated. We have the schedule start time and the schedule end time. We also have adjusted time in and out. So if you had to manually change any of the information, you could adjust those as well. So we have 6 different fields that make a combination of schedule and clock in and clock out times.
Okay. So as long as there is no need to capture another check-in and check-out at midnight and sending with the same latitude and longitude the geo information, if that is acceptable, that will be fine. If you are sending as a separate shift.
Yeah, separate shift. So from a payrolls perspective, we see a lot of the alternate EDV vendors split so that you could pay for yesterday and pay for today. So sending those as 2 separate records is completely acceptable.
We can use the same geo information, right?
Geocode.
Even though we geocoding for the check-in and check-out. No need to capture again.
Same lat and long. Well, so we send the visit record, or we send the clock in times and the clock out times as 2 separate records, and we'll get there on the visit. So you could potentially have a different GPS on clock in than you do on clock out.
Okay, so we can use the same clock in GPS for the 12 a.m. and we can use the same clock out GPS for the 12 a.m. on the previous day.
Yep, exactly.
Okay, that answers my question. Thank you.
And I saw a bunch of questions flying by there, Ruth and Andrea. Anything specific to frequency or the discussion we just had?
I think for most of them, you've answered a lot of them in terms of overnight billing.
All right. So do we only have an hour left, Ruth?
I think an hour and a half.
Okay. So jumping back to the specification, page 10, page 11, page 12, and page 13 are rules, various rules on how we collect or send data if no visit or if no client matches the visit record, things like that. More informational, more guidelines for your technical team. So as you receive exceptions or as you receive validation errors, you know how to handle those. So we do put some code in place to make sure we're adherent from a data collection perspective. And as I mentioned earlier, we'll get to those specific lookup values when we get to the visit information. So I'm going to scroll down. Acknowledgement and response. So let's get to the data file itself so we can dive into each of the sections. As I mentioned at the opening, we're going to go first through client. Clients are the members and the information we're looking for there from your systems. Then we're going to go through employees, so those caregivers in the field that are providing service to your membership. And then last, we'll get into visits and what visits mean. So from a creation of JSON perspective, the first data element is always the provider information. And when we refer to provider, we mean the provider agency, or in this case, the 6-digit Medicaid ID that you've been provided from the state or from Access. The provider qualifier field is a string value field, and it is the literal value of Medicaid ID. And in column 2 or item 2 in the JSON package, you're going to enter your 6-digit ID. If yours is less than 6, 5 in some cases, you're going to pad it with a leading 0. In all of the segments that you'll send us, you'll always send these 2 data elements so we know specifically which provider agency you are and which account to record your visit records in. If this information is excluded, the system will reject the batch and you'll have to retransmit. So starting on the top of page 19 is the client information. So the client information that we're looking for here is your membership. So those members who you've been authorized to provide service for, that includes the client ID, or client ID is the first one, you don't have to send that, but first name, middle initial, last name, employee qualifier, client Medicaid ID, client ID, those things down here from a column perspective. If you look over here on the require field, where it says required yes, that's a field that must be included every time you send the transaction. Those that are listed as optional, as I mentioned in the opening, they are provided if you have. So what I recommend is that you code for all of the values that are provided here. If you don't have, in this case, a middle initial, you can pass a null value or a blank string value, and that will pass validation. But we're really looking to receive all of the information that's defined in the addenda if it's available in your systems. Where we're going to do a match from a client perspective is on this client Medicaid ID. So we're going to look up the client Medicaid ID that was provided in a inbound member file from the state system and ensure that the state says that that is a valid client to receive service for this program. If we don't have a match, that client record will get rejected for no match found.
Hey, John, we just lost your screen, and now it looks like, yeah.
Here's
Yep.
that somebody else inadvertently took over the share. So if you could reshare your screen. Yep.
Is that better, Andrea?
Yep, we're back to where you were. Thank you.
Okay. So as I mentioned, we're going to do the match on Medicaid ID. There are additional client qualifiers where you're going to pass exactly the same value multiple times. It may seem a little redundant from a payload perspective, but each of those values drives a different behavior in the SAN data system. So we just ask in places where you see the same, in this case, Medicaid ID in multiple fields, you're just going to repeat the output of that value in this specific column pairing so that SAN data can make use of it. We can apply the program rules that Arizona has defined, and that we get a corrected visit into the system so that it can be verified and validated from a claims validation perspective.
John, we're getting a couple questions on client in general.
Yep.
This one came from Garrett. Do we need to upload all historical inactive clients or just active clients?
Just active clients that you're going to collect visits for going forward.
Perfect. And then I think this one was from Sue. So client Medicaid ID and client identifier are both client Medicaid ID?
That is correct.
Perfect.
And in this spec, you're actually going to pass it 4 times. We're going to pass it in client Medicaid ID, the client identifier field, client custom, and client other. Again, from a SAN data perspective, we use those various IDs to match to various portions of the application. Because we're not using the SAN data system to collect a visit, we apply different logic at different places. This ensures that we can collect that record, we can verify the client is a valid client, we can load it correctly so that your visit data loads into the system correctly as well.
And Mike has another question and has his hand raised.
Go ahead, Mike. I think you're open.
Yes. So this Medicaid ID, as you said, we need to send in the 4 different places: client Medicaid ID, client custom ID, client other ID, and client identifier.
That's correct.
If the client is discharged and if we readmit the client after a few weeks, then if we send that client again with the same Medicaid ID, there is no other identifier, right? Because we are sending the same Medicaid ID in all the 4 fields. It will not be rejected as a duplicate?
Correct. So we'll have matching logic where we do a couple of things. We actually use client Medicaid ID column to match to the states file. So we make sure that the client was provided in the states file. This client identifier we use to match in the SAN data system, so that if we do find a match within your provider agency, we update or edit the record rather than create a new. So it won't create a duplicate and it won't reject for duplicate either.
As long as those 4 fields is having the same client Medicaid ID, that it will not be rejected.
Yep.
I remember in one of the other states like Colorado recently where it was showing another field called client ID. It was a field that will be generated by SAN data. Initially in the specs that was not there, and later in the updated one I have seen. So this client ID what you have at the top, this one what data we have to send, like can it be same as the Medicaid ID or something else?
It's actually going to be blank for this client because SAN data is going to generate it, and we're going to use this client identifier to do the match for you so that you don't have to pass this field.
It is listed as optional, but if we start sending it, even though it is optional, can we start sending our own ID or it should be always blank?
It should always be blank.
Okay. Thank you.
And Stephen Lake, I think you had the same exact question. So just reiterating that client ID, send it as blank.
Hello?
Hi.
Is there another question?
Yeah, I have just thinking about the client ID since it is optional. In case if we send the client ID, are we going to ignore that or it will reject?
I have to look, Mike. I think I don't know. I'll have to
because
find out.
the reason why I'm asking is in the Colorado state we have seen that as required initially, so we started sending it. Then when it is changed to optional, we were not sure for the previous clients that were sent if we stop sending it, that would create any problem.
Yeah, we're doing some work client ID across the board, Mike, and we'll make that actually a no pass data element because we're going to calculate it within the SAN data system.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and just a couple other questions, just looking to see if we can update the specification to state that. So once we do that digging, we'll find out what happens if you do send it, if we reject it or not. And we'll make sure to get that noted here appropriately.
Exactly. Yep. We'll provide additional feedback here and work to get it published as well so that it's more clearly stated on what to send in that field.
All right, point taken.
The next two sections are what we call subsections of client. They are address and phone number. We're requesting that you send one address to accompany your client record and one phone number to accompany your client record. That information gets stored in addition to the information that's provided at the state level. So again, we're looking to expand the information that we know about our population, where they're residing, where they're receiving service. It's not a hindrance to service. It's not to prevent service. It's, again, a way for the state to receive a little bit more data on their population to see if there's ways that they can better serve their population, where those individuals are receiving service, et cetera. It also helps us match GPS. So if you have a service location where your clients are receiving service and we get that information, we can match the geo or GPS location to that client address because we use all the addresses on file to do the matching. Makes us a little more CURES compliant, right? Because location is one of the CURES elements that we're trying to solve for. There are several fields in here from a client address perspective, as you would note, that are required. So type, is it a primary address or a secondary address? Address line 1, city, state, and zip. There's two fields on here, the address latitude and the address longitude, that are optional. Some vendor solutions do calculate the GPS for the address on the client. If you don't have that information, if you include them and you pass null or blank strings, the SAN data system will actually calculate the latitude and longitude for that address that you provided on behalf of that client record. Phone number is similar. We're looking for phone type and a phone number formatted in all numbers. So follow the format rules for these city, state, and zip codes because we're looking for all 9 on the zip code and then a full address with no formatting. I think the last section here before we get into employees is the client designee.
Just real quick, John, a couple questions before we move on.
Oh yeah, sure, go ahead.
Yeah, from Sue, does the time zone in the client file have to be Mountain Standard Time for Arizona, or is any valid time zone allowed?
This client time zone? The valid values are in Appendix 5. We know that Arizona changes between Mountain Time and Standard Time and will account for daylight savings, but we're looking for the standard based on the address of that client to be passed. So is it Arizona time or the Mountain Time, or I believe the Navajo Nation follows Mountain Time, so there's a few different variations there. We're looking for you to provide the time zone where that client address is present.
Okay, thank you.
And then Garrick, you had a couple questions on client phone number. Specifically, does the Alt-EVV system check the client's the telephonic visit record against the client phone numbers? Sorry, can't speak.
We do not. We don't match phone number. Phone numbers, again, additional data element for the state. We consume the file, or we consume the phone number based on visit type and the visit information, and we just record that, but we do no matching on phone number itself.
Perfect. And then a couple of questions, and then we can move on about multiple client addresses and multiple phone numbers. Does that require that they pass multiple client records?
You do not. So in JSON, if you need to talk about this in a little bit more detail, we can. So you can nest the client address and the client phone number into multiple child nodes underneath the base client record itself. So you would do and it's hard to do without seeing it, but it's curly bracket, all the information, close bracket, and you do a comma and a curly, and then the next set of addresses, and you can pass as many of the subnodes as you need to. So you can pass more than one address record, more than one phone number, and when we get to it, more than one designee for a single client without creating an additional client payload to pass that information. So you just sub-embed them underneath that client record. Hopefully that made sense. That's a little bit hard and a little more technical, so hopefully that answers the question. Anything else, Ruth?
Just one last one. What if clients live in very rural areas? I think this is more of a policy question. Oh, and Derry, you put a response in the chat, so take a look at that. I think it was Lori that had sent it.
Any other questions on the base client so far? And then we're going to talk about designee.
We do have Sue Turlock raising her hand. Sue, go ahead and unmute your phone and ask your question.
Thank you. Just really quick. I know you said the client payer segment is not required, but we send it for other Sandata states. Is it okay if we send it? Will you reject it?
I will not reject it if you send it. You don't need to, but if you have it in your code base for other states, you can send it and we'll just skip over it.
Great. Thank you very much.
Yep. Yeah, we didn't code prepare because we're going to take it in the visit record. Anything else? Ruth, Andrea, questions? Oh, sorry, I got chat back up.
Yeah, so just to be clear, there are 3 separate files submitted for clients, one with client general info, one for phone, and one for address, and are all of these required to be sent daily?
So they're not separate files for client. You pass all of the information as a single transaction. So the client general, the client address, and the client phone as one transaction record. Clients you do not have to send daily. What I recommend is you send all of your active clients when you initially go to production, and then you send additional client records as you gain more membership along the way. Client is only used to match to your visit records. So if we've not received an active client from your submission and we get an ID that doesn't match one that you've passed us, the visit record gets rejected. So again, my recommendation is send all active clients, and then incrementally as you receive new clients, pass those to the Sandata system, but you don't have to do that daily unless you receive new clients daily. There's no need, but we do want you to have or send the clients as soon as you receive those additional ones.
And then we're getting a couple more designee questions in if you want to move on to that section, John.
Yep. So designee, an individual who can act on behalf of the recipient of care. In this case, we're looking for designees that may have the ability to approve visits. The caregiver was here at this time for this service and this duration. Client designees act on behalf of the member themselves, the individual that's receiving service. If you pass designees and that member does have a designee, we want to receive that information. We call the section optional because we know not every single member in the state program will have a designee. But if you do pass designee information, and we encourage you to and recommend you do in cases where you have it, those listed as yes are required and they need to be accompanied in here or within the payload itself. Conditional file, here's the rule for that conditional field. Start date and end dates. We don't technically track eligibility on when the designee starts and ends. That's why they are conditional dates. But if you do track when they're available, maybe it was a power of attorney, maybe they were just discharged in a short amount of time, you can pass us the start and end dates. And then we do like to get this relationship field if you have it. So again, we're looking to expand the information that the state knows about its memberships as we look for cures at compliance and adherence, but also are there ways that we can help the members and better serve the membership in that field? If we understand who the designees are, live-in spouses, mothers, fathers in most cases, please send us that information for those that you have designees. From a coding perspective, if you want to code for designee, there's the ability to send all blanks because the section is optional. If you didn't have designee information, it would come out as all blank values, and we would be able to process that record, even with all nulls. But if you send a first name, for instance, and we start to parse through the designee record, you need to provide all of the items that are required in order to make that designee record whole. So pause there. Lots of info on designee. Ruth, Andrea, questions on that?
Garrick, I think you had the question about activation and termination dates specifically for designees. What happens if the system doesn't have historical data on when a designee started? So if you want to unmute yourself and maybe elaborate more on that before we move on.
Good morning.
Good morning.
My name is Garrick. I'm with Abrio. And let's see, the designee start date and end date are conditional based upon the client designee status, but they're not allowed to be backdated or future dated. So if we don't have data on that, what value should we put in there? Should we put in the first or January 1st, 2021 when the system starts? Or how are we supposed to process dates in there?
So the status field, which is client designee status, and the two start and end dates work in combination. So if you send us a designee status of active or inactive, you can pass these as null values or blank strings. So if you're always, and this is for any place, if you're going to always send us a client status, you can exclude these two fields. If you do not send us a client designee status, then we look for a start date and an end date.
To continue, it says on your end date that future and back date is not acceptable. So we would have to send today's date on the end date?
Yeah, so my recommendation, because you're sending us a designee, and if you have it on file, that you would send client designee status with this 02 indicator, which means they're active, and I would not pass the client start and end date, is my recommendation.
Okay, thank you.
And so any field that's optional, you can always send that blank or no value if you don't have it in your system. Stephen asked about collecting designee information. Do they need to collect it? I'll defer to Dara on that one if you want to. They're not collecting designee. Do they need to start collecting designee? And she can post that in chat, Stephen. Dara will get to that one momentarily. Any other questions that you guys saw on designee?
Yeah, I think we're okay to move on, John.
Okay. So let's move to the next section, employee. So employee cures, we need to understand who provides service to which individual. We're looking for start times and end times and service codes, but we need the information on the employee or the individual caregiver in the field that provided the service. So much like client, employee has its own endpoint. Employee we're going to send as a single transaction. We're going to send all the employee general information in one block. I recommend that you send all of your active employees when we go to production And then as your system changes and you add or remove employees, you send those updates to the SAN data system. One of the checks on the visit record is that we get this employee identifier, which is the full SSN based on the state's definition and program. And we're going to check to see if we have an employee record that was a valid employee record that was sent to the SAN data system for your particular agency. Most of the fields within employee, so the qualifier, the identifier, a sequence number, which is a timestamp, the employee SSN, last name, first name, email address, we'll talk in a moment, employee hire date, and employee end date. For the top 7 values, those are all required. So we'll want all of the information on them so we can uniquely identify those individuals that are providing service. Hire date and end date are optional fields. You can pass them. They are technically not used in the SAN data system. So we're just looking for the presence of a matching employee qualifier. We don't source payroll. We're not the source of truth for payroll. We're not the source of truth for the HR records. That's why the hire date, start and end are optional fields. My recommendation is you include those two, pass them as blanks, unless you want to send the information to the employee. Employee email, we will be discussing as a SAN data unit. Employee email is required on the SAN data EVV side in order for the employee to use the technologies on a SAN data mobile platform. Since this is an alternate EVV system, we do not need, or we may not pass the employee email. We're in discussions now on whether that can be an optional or omit field rather than a required field. As we mentioned with the other updates and edits that we're doing after these reviews, we will post updates to the team and post an updated amendment once some of the other discussions have been completed. But again, employee email, key identifier in the employee in the SAN data systems in order for you to use the SAN data EVV system, not necessarily required from an alternate EVV solution. So we're working towards making that a do not send field. And correct, Michelle, we're working towards that omit. Questions on employee. Tried to make it as small as possible, but again, from a curious perspective, we need to know who provided the service.
Yeah, so there was a question just trying to understand who the employee actually is. In this case, it is the care worker, so like John just mentioned, who provided the service. And then lots of questions came in about email, so we covered that. And then the last one that I saw, can alternative IDs be sent for the full Social Security number? I think we'll need to point back to Dara on that one, but for the specification, we are looking for the full Social Security number for the employees.
Yes, Brad, we fixed the extension for email, but we're going to try to exclude it here. All right, in the interest of time, let's jump forward. If there's any other questions on employee, we'll circle back. The SSN question, as Ruth mentioned, we'll get Dara from a policy perspective to provide some guidance there. Currently, it's defined as full SSN, but we'll work through those details as we go forward here. The next big section, or the next item, is visit. As many of you know, and I see several familiar names that have either integrated with us or in the process of integrating with the SAN data system. We tried to keep the visit general information the same across programs, but specifically highlight and define those additional data units that the Arizona program is going to require for us to be compliant within their program rules. Scheduling is one of those items from an adherence perspective. Condition, there's a couple other ones, then we'll get to those here momentarily. But visit general information, we send the visit as well as the call information, the call in and the call out as a single transaction. We're looking for all of the fields, again, that are yes values to be passed within the payload. Optional fields don't necessarily mean they're optional from sending from a program adherence perspective, but you may or may not have that value. So I recommend you code for those, passing null values where they don't apply, and sending the information where they do apply. From a visit perspective, we're going to match on a couple of keys. One is this employee identifier. As you saw up above an employee, we're passing the employee SSN and the full 9. We're actually going to match this to the records that you have passed us to ensure that we've received that employee or that caregiver, individual who provided service in the field, that we have a matching record for that. As you move to the top of page 23, you have the client identifier. We're pointing at client custom ID, and we're looking for that Medicaid ID that you passed in the field in your client record. So we check the client record against the state's source system when you send us the client, but then we check the visit information against the clients that you have provided us to ensure that that is a client, active client, that you've provided us in a previous payload. So we're going to check for that employee and our caregiver in the field, and we're going to check for the client to make sure we have adherence. You see here on the visit, we're passing 2 of the IDs. Again, they do different things in the SAN data system. So from a accuracy perspective and a exception of visit perspective, we need both of those. They're repeat values, but they do different things within the SAN data system to make that a valid record. Visit canceled indicator, in most cases, you're going to pass completed visits, so that's going to default to false. We're not canceling this visit. If there is a need to cancel a visit and retransmit, I know I've spoken with a number of you on that. We have policies and procedures in place, and we can help you work through how you do a canceled visit. We'll do those as you're doing your onboarding, testing, and checklists. Payer information. So back to Sue's question earlier, I believe it was Sue that asked the question. Because it's multi-payer, multi-program for the Arizona program, we're looking for the payer information that's specific to that individual visit. So what payer and program combination defined here in Appendix 1 is valid for that particular visit record that you've collected. So was it from one of the MCOs, was it a state employee, etc. Columns 12 through 16 have to do with the procedure code and the modifiers. So what actual visit, what procedure code and what modifiers were used at the time of that visit. For claims validation, we will match to program or procedure code and modifier combinations. The modifiers can be in any order, but we prefer that you order them in the order that you're going to bill them for from a claims perspective, and we will use those to match. So T1019 TU, it needs to be T1019 TU in the visit record so that we match on the claims validation side. The procedure code modifier combinations are in Appendix 2, and it has to be a valid combination. We will not accept a procedure code modifier combination that isn't explicitly listed in the appendix. We have the visit time zone, so this is the time zone, usually Arizona or Mountain for this program. The scheduled start and the scheduled end. So here's where we're going to apply the logic from a scheduled perspective. So for that visit, you enter the time, the exact time that it was scheduled for. It does not have to align to the clock in and clock out times. If you've asked your individual caregiver to arrive at 9 o'clock and they don't arrive until 9:30, there's no need to update the schedule. We just want to know from a trending perspective, when was the actual service scheduled for a start time and when was the scheduled service for the end time. This can come out of your scheduling system or your agency management system from a schedule perspective. The next piece of that is the contingency plan. So the contingency plan says, if I miss my scheduled start and end times for any reason, what does the member want to do for my next steps? Do I reschedule within 2 hours? Do I reschedule within 24 hours, 48 hours, skip this visit, go to the next one, or non-paid caregiver? Contingency plan is specific to Arizona. So since we got here, I want to pause and open it up for specific questions on contingency plan.
Hi, Garrick. I know you had a question in the chat. Feel free to come off mute. I'll post it here, but contingency plan is really an optional field. So we are in discussions with Tashana and Dara to move forward with making this a required field that we'll be posting in an updated specification in the future. But it's a really good question, and I think we've seen that a few times, not just in this meeting, but others. So again, feel free to come off mute if you want to elaborate on that a little bit.
So this is Garrick again, and so if it's a required field, then I guess the question is kind of mute because we can set the contingency plan value. But if it still is going to be optional and you want to do MPS reporting, because this is one of the fields for MPS reporting, will you pull that from the list of Appendix 2 has a list of contingency plan values based upon service. Is that where you guys will pull it from?
We'll default that service to that contingency plan, correct? If one's not provided.
Hi, this is Leslie. So the contingency plan here, so if it's going to, you're saying it'll be required potentially in the future. Right now, it's going to default to whatever the codes are in the appendices.
Correct.
Now, because I thought I saw something that Crosswalk seems to talk a lot about the contingency plan, but there's very little in the actual spec here that kind of talks about it aside from this one optional thing. What else is related to the contingency plan that we need to know about?
So there's again just this contingency plan field, which this indicates the member's preference. So if your provider agencies are going out into the field and working with their members, and the member says, I want this specific service and modifier combination to be rescheduled within 2 hours, that's what you would send here. We also have an appendix further below that also defines those defaults per service code like John had mentioned. So after the visit has taken place, if a contingency plan was needing to be executed, you would denote that in the resolution code field, and we'll get down to that section here in just a bit. But in general, it's this contingency plan field here, and then we're going to be looking for which one was executed in the resolution code.
And what about the attestation field that was mentioned as well in the crosswalk?
Oh, yes, that's a great point and a good call out. We do have a field here, and John will probably get to it here in just a bit, but there is a field that's provider attestation, basically saying, I think it's a true or false, that the agency has attested that they've worked with a member on an every 90-day basis to confirm what that preferred contingency plan needs to be.
And then we do have a couple questions with people raising their hands. So Matt D. from Acumen, if you want to take yourself off mute and ask your question.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep. Hey, Matt, how are you?
Good. How are you?
Good.
Thanks for taking my question. I actually have, because we kind of covered two parts there in between the opportunities to ask questions. We covered the schedule requirements as well as contingency plans. So I'll ask, since we're talking about contingency plan, I'll ask that first. Since the table in the Appendix 2 lists default contingency plans per service code, and there's also, is it a member preference per service code, or is it a member preference across those? And if it had to be executed. So if and the business requirement says if it's late or missed, so if it starts late, and I don't know if there's a threshold for how late it started per the schedule, as related to the scheduled time, we pass the contingency plan, and that's a preference value. And then in the reason code, if we did have to execute a contingency plan in the reason code section, which is down below and to be covered, that's where you pass the identifier of the contingency plan that was actually executed. So is one a preference, and down below is what actually happened, or which contingency plan was actually used. Is that right?
Yep, you've got it exactly right.
Yep,
okay,
that's right.
So does that mean but you also are providing default values for contingency plans per service code. So, and if it's not optional, or should we just be passing, so the client can have a different preference than the default per service code?
Yep, that's right. So the default is really meant to just be provided if the member has not indicated they want one of these five options here.
Okay, so if it's default to service code S5181, its default contingency plan is CPO1. If the client has a different preference and the visit that we are aggregating is S5181, and let's just say the member's preference is CPO2, we would pass CPO2 as their preferred, and if CPO2 actually had to happen because they were late or missed, we would cover we'd pass CPO2 in the resolutions, in the reason code section. Is that right?
Exactly.
All right, that covers I apologize, I don't mean to dominate the conversation, but again, I had two questions. So related to schedules, so for fiscal intermediaries, or acronyms of fiscal intermediary, are schedules required? I understand from previous meetings it's required a lot, and I wasn't clear if it's on the traditional agency where the care workers all work for them, and they have supervisors that manage the care workers' time, and they create schedules, and the employees are expected to follow those schedules within reason. But on the FI side, on the fiscal intermediary side, schedules are not typically used. And so I just want to be clear, is schedules required for both FIs and traditional agencies?
We do have, this is Andrea from Sandata. We are meeting with the state to review that specific policy question, and so we'll have to, right now they are, but we're under discussion. So we'll have to get back to you on that.
And Dara just posted an update.
Oh, perfect. Thanks, Dara. And then, did that answer your questions? And are we ready to move on to the next person who has their hand raised?
Yeah. And Leslie, as Ruth said, we're going to work on that this week so that you should have that as soon as we wrap up here and get all the comments and feedbacks. We will work with the state, make any edits, and then publish this, I don't want to say revised, but modified and updated to provide more clarification to everybody.
Dara posted a comment saying scheduling is not required for self-directed attendant care. Is that a final decision?
Yes, that's the way we've got our systems configured right now.
Yeah, that's what we're testing too, Matt. We're still going through just to make sure that is. And then Dara just posted, yes, that's a final. So for FI or self-directed care, that schedule is not required.
Okay, thank you.
Great. Michelle Cashwell, you've had your hand patiently raised for a while. Why don't you unmute yourself and ask your questions?
I think I'm okay. It's around the contingency plan. We don't currently track that in our systems, so it certainly sounds like we would have to use your defaults if it's a required field.
Yeah, use the default, Michelle, and we'll talk about that when we regroup and do our deep dive on how that applies to your particular solution.
Okay, thank you.
And one more question from Mike. Go ahead and unmute and ask your question.
Hi, it's Mike again. Regarding this contingency plan, you said you will be changing it to a required field. So when it is required field for every schedule for all client, we need to send the contingency plan.
That is correct.
Okay, so then
so the goal, Mike, is that we get get each of the clients that are receiving care to set their contingency plan so that you have it at the client level and you can pass it for all their visits. So if they choose to say 24 hours, they choose to say 48 hours. The default is really intended for, I haven't had a chance to get the client to set that contingency plan. So guidance from the state says for this service code, it should be this plan. But we really hope that we can work with our individual clients in the field and get those set for everybody.
So it can be different for few visits as well, right? Like we get the contingency plan set for the client, then the same thing we have to send for every visit. And in the middle, for some visits, we can send a different contingency plan as per client, or it is same always for a client?
So it's really procedure code level driven, right? Some are more critical that the patient receives care as quickly as possible, respite and a few of those things. So it may not be the same for every single one. The client may have a preference on what they want it to be, but really from a procedural perspective, some of it should be driven by that individual service that the client is receiving. But depending on your population, it may be the default to the same for all of your membership. That help, hurt, make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. I have one more question regarding the schedules. If we have two payers eligible for the client, and when there is a schedule created, like we have two services provided in a single visit, and let's say it is a 4-hour visit, 2 hours will be for one of the payer and 2 hours will be for a different payer. So for the purpose of documentation, we will have a single visit and we'll do single documentation since it is a continuous shift. So in this case, since the payer is different, when we are sending the visit information with a different payer, is it required to capture the geolocation again, or we can send the entire 4-hour clock in and out for both the payers separately?
How do you bill that visit? Do you bill that visit just to the state at the 4 hours?
No, we bill 2 hours for each payer. If the payer is different, we will bill it separately to different payers. We'll split it 2 hours and bill separately.
So then we want the visit separated to the 2 payer records, 2 hours for each, and the sub information could be the same, right? So 2-hour clock in, clock out, but geo numbers, locations, that can all be the same, just in 2 different visit records.
Okay, just to make sure, if we are sending in 2 different visit records, and if we are only capturing single check-in geolocation and single checkout geolocation, and when we are doing the split, we use the same geolocation, same as the overnight, and we can send it. That will be still compliant, correct? It's not recommended to capture separately.
Yep, that's right.
In this case, it's like we are sending the edited hours because the system is doing the split and it's not the actual time that was captured by the system. Like when they do the check-in, it will capture the real time. When they do the checkout, it will capture the real time. In the middle of the shift, we are doing a split because of these 2 hours for each payer. So if the system is doing the split automatically, it doesn't matter.
Yeah, so I would use it, in that case, I would use adjusted time in and out to do the 2 hours for each block and send all the other information exactly the same for both records. And the SAN data system will use adjusted time in and time out to do the claims validation match.
So we send the 4-hour in the regular check-in and checkout side, and in the adjusted time, we'll send it for 2 hours?
Yep, 2 hours in that block for each of the pairs. Correct.
Only adjusted time 2 hours, but the main one will still be 4 hours, or that also will be 4 hours?
Yep, correct. And then from a reporting perspective, we can see that it was one continuous visit that we adjusted into 2 blocks to satisfy the pair.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
Anything else, Ruth or Andrea, on contingency that we need to discuss from anybody?
I think just a couple policy questions came in through there, but Dara's providing responses.
Perfect. Okay, so then let's talk about the end of the visit. So we have a bill visit indicator of true false. Bill visit means that you're going to actually create a claim, so I recommend passing this as a true value, just in case, because we can use it in conjunction with the visit count indicator to null, or what we create is omit a visit from being available for payment or billing. And the rest of the fields are optional from a delivery perspective. We are looking for client verified times, client verified tasks, and client verified services, as well as the client signature and a voice recording. So those are client attestation to the visit itself. Do they essentially approve the visit? Did they agree with the time in and time out? Did they agree with the tasks that were collected for that particular visit? And were you able to capture a signature? We know not in all cases that the client is available. Could be asleep, could be unavailable for whatever reason, and you weren't able to collect that information. We can pass those as null. It doesn't make it non-compliant. But in cases where we don't get client visit, what we call verification or validation, we will want to know why that occurred. So in that case, we'll want a reason code and a resolution code on client unavailable, technology unavailable, some reason why you weren't able to capture that client verification information.
Hey, John, just a quick question. Garrick, I think you had said we might have skipped fields 21 through 26. Did you have specific questions on those, and in which segment?
This is Garrick again. The questions I have are about rescheduling. When do we mark a reschedule indicator? And then also about the adjusted in date times, adjusted out date times, and how those are going to be interacting with the call date time fields and what is expected. I have some scenarios if you would like me to bring them up.
Yeah, so let's talk adjusted time in and time out. The call information is what was actually captured in the field and is not changed. So what we want to do is record the visit as it took place. Where was the caregiver? What time did they clock in for which person and which service? Adjusted times allow the agency to make modifications to those times. They don't change the actual call in and call out times, but they modify the record for whatever reason. Say in the case that you had a clock in and no clock out, you could provide just an adjusted time out, which overrides because you were missing that clock out time, and vice versa. They are truly meant to be manual adjustments to the record. I clocked out too early, I forgot to clock in, etc. They will mark from a program adherence perspective that this record was manually updated and it wasn't moved to what we call an auto-verified state. So we didn't use technology to capture all of the information, but we made a change to that record. Does that help?
So that helps. So you have three different values coming in. You have the scheduled values, you have actual call clock-in records, and then you also have adjusted. So, and at the end of the day, the adjusted is what you're going to use to determine the hours worked if its values are provided. Is that correct?
Right. So if adjusted time in and time out are provided, that will be the hours used to match against claims. We would prefer that those are actually blank most of the time and that we were using technology to capture all the information. But if you do have to adjust a record, that will be the end value used on the claims validation side.
So the scenario we run across often is the employee, caregiver, clocks out 10 minutes. They're supposed to work a 2-hour shift. They clock out at 2 hours and 10 minutes. we automatically adjust them to 2 hours so that they don't exceed the auth values. And so that's a lot of adjustments that we would be sending over. And so we'd use the adjusted out date time for that. Does that sound correct?
Correct. You'd move that back to 2 hours.
That's it for that one. And then when do we use the reschedule? I think that might be more of a policy question.
So I'm going to answer it from a SAN data perspective. We do reschedule a value indicator of yes when the original start time and end time have been modified, and it could be at the request of the client, at the request of the designee, the agency itself, right? So if you've rescheduled a previous scheduled service, we're just looking to see if that indicator was set to yes. But in the record, we're actually looking for that rescheduled start and end time. So originally I had my schedule for 9 o'clock to 10 o'clock. The client says don't come until noon, so I reschedule that visit to go noon to 1. In the visit record, we're going to say the schedule was noon to 1, but we want to know that that visit itself was actually rescheduled. An additional data element that the state is looking to collect to do some analysis on those. Does that make sense?
It does, and I could probably ask more questions about that, but it looks like Dara they're planning an FAQ for these scenarios, so thank you.
We're going to do a more in-depth review on scheduling itself. When that applies, when that doesn't apply, we'll get into a lot of those details. And hopefully that guidance helps guide what we're going to do here. We don't want to make it overly complicated, but we are looking for, those scenarios where we are adjusting when the original schedule was to occur, and look for trends and tracking in that place.
John, we have one more question from a raised hand, James Carpenter. If you want to go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question. Thanks for waiting.
Yeah, thank you. So my question is on the client verification with the signature and the voice recording. Is it a requirement that the EVV system you're using is able to collect those elements, like physically make a voice recording or collect a signature on like a phone or something, or is it just that we have to create that documentation outside of the EVV system?
So I'm going to defer to Dara on that question from a requirement that we have to capture the signature or voice recording. The SAN data does provide, in their EVV solution, we do provide the ability to capture both. In our telephony solution, obviously it's just a voice recording, but in our mobile technology, we have the ability for voice recording as well as signature. We're just looking for yes that client has attested to that. Whether Dara, per policy, if we want to enforce that we need to capture that visit. See, she just posted something. She wanted you to post that question in chat so that she can address it directly from a policy side.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Michelle, I think you've got a question as well. What if we send the bill hours? We talked about, will the claims match be looking at the hours to bill field as discussed for prioritization?
It does not look at
for
bill.
Pennsylvania, sorry. That was
for Pennsylvania.
So, John, we had talked about Beata choosing to send the hours to bill instead of you guys calculating the duration and the claims match working off of that.
Correct. For Arizona, we are we're using start time and end time, and we're applying billing logic so that we can match to the claims unit. So we need start and end in that visit general section, either in the adjusted time or the actual time in and time out, Michelle, to do that calculation per the policy here in Arizona. And Michelle, we can talk about that in a deep dive because I have a couple of thoughts even after we talked about the other program where I think we can drive to successful outcomes.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, James, for posting that question. Anything else, Ruth, Andrea, questions?
One just came in. Valwick, go ahead and unmute your mic and ask your question.
Yeah, my main question is about how you handle respite daily when you have multiple providers. You ask for a procedure code, and the respite daily procedure code is different from the respite 15-minute code. How would you submit something like that? If there's two providers, let's say somebody worked for 6 hours and then somebody else came in and replaced them for another 6 hours.
Yep. So each of the caregivers would record their own visit record, and when you sent the claim in for the total record, we would add up the two visits together and calculate units to match to the claim.
So would we have to set the procedure modifier?
Procedure modifier would have to be day to match the claim, correct? If you're billing for the day unit.
Yeah, so the in and out would be 6 hours for one. In and out would be 6 hours for the other, but the procedure modifier for both would be the daily modifier.
Correct, and you would take time for the first visit, added to time for the second visit, apply the day logic, and get a 1 unit match for your claim.
Okay.
Did that help? So let's talk about the subcomponents or child components of the visit general. So the visit general.
Hey, John, sorry. We have one more hand raised in this section from Sue Turlack. Sue, go ahead with your question.
Okay, sorry, just one quick question. So
go ahead.
You talked about the adjusted call-in or time-in, time-out. Are you comparing that against the call type? So if the call type comes in as manual, are you expecting adjusted time-in, time-out? Will that be rejected if there's not?
Nope. If you do manual and it's actual call time, you can leave adjusted time in and time out as manual. We just use it as an override, regardless of type, right, Sue? So if your type is mobile and you override it, that's adjusted. If your type is manual, there's no need to adjust it because we know it's manual at that point.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
Does that help?
Yes.
Good. All right, so let's dive in. Calls, call history, reason codes, tasks are sub-elements of the general record. And I've spoken with a few of you on this call, and we'll get to know most of the others as we go through and work through this integration. But think of the general visit as your summary record. So what did I do in summary? Down below is the child records. So the call-in and the call-out are recorded as two different activities. They can be chained together so you don't have to pass the visit general multiple times. So we're going to send both of those call records, and then we're going to support any of the history or changes or updates that may have occurred along the way. That could occur in the first time you send the visit, or it may occur on a follow-up visit, right? So you send the visit, the agency makes an update or a change, and then we're going to send the updated general record as well as the change log. So there's different scenarios that we'll work through. Part of the testing checklist walks us through those scenarios so that we're able to account for and adjust a record that was previously send in a clean record the first time where we never have to touch it, and then ongoing modifications or changes to that record as we go forward. I know that each of the systems works slightly differently, so as we get into the specifics, you've submitted your request, we start to engage with your vendor from an integration perspective. We'll work through the specifics of your system on how it captures and logs each of these specific interactions. How does it do a call in? How does it do a call out? We've talked to some about payroll and splitting logic, but we really want you to ensure that your system can capture the data that's required for the program without making a lot of changes or burden within your vendors or your vendor source systems. So the calls themselves, as I mentioned, I don't want to go through every single column here, but the call is the detail of that record. In general, when did it occur? What method was used to collect it? Mobile, telephonic, manual, other? What procedure was captured? Which procedure code was captured at the time that call was? And then there's a bunch of conditional fields. Conditional fields in the call detail have to do with what call type it was. So we know that there is no call latitude, call longitude for a manual record. It's just not possible to collect. So in those cases, you would pass null values. But as we go through it, based on the call type that you're sending us, certain values below are required. The mobile login, if you're using a mobile technology, we will capture latitude, we will capture longitude. The mobile login simply is the login that was used to capture that information. Doesn't necessarily have to relate to the employee, but what indicator was it? It could be your unique identifier in your system for the employee. It could be a number of things. We're just looking to ensure that the credentials that were used to capture the system were captured at the time of visit. Telephony PIN. If the call was mobile type, you wouldn't have a telephony PIN. But again, the PIN number is another identifier, another indicator to show who actually logged that call into your systems. Location is a value that we can set as well. That is, did I capture it in the home? Did I capture it in the community, et cetera? And we'll talk through, again, the specifics of your system and what needs to be captured. But we want to set the conditional fields based on the call type. My recommendation is to code for all of them. Only pass the ones where you meet the proper condition that requires that field to be populated. Sending a null string for the other values will pass validation and will not prevent the record from rejecting in the SAN data system. Then I'm going to touch on the next couple of items. One is visit exceptions. Visit exceptions occur when the program or the record itself didn't align to the program definition. By default, if we've adhered to the items in the formatting that was recommended in the base records, in a high percentage of cases, you'll never pass an exception. We're only looking for completed visits, those that have been completely fixed and verified. They have all the cures elements. We have matches on client, we have matches on employee. So again, in most cases, the visit exception section will be rarely used. Visit changes is a different approach. So visit changes occur when a visit has been sent to the state's aggregator system and an update has occurred. I rolled back a claim, I had to adjust a record, and I need to send a modified adjusted time in and time out. What we're looking for in the change log is details on what fields changed, who made that change, and the date of that change. More from an audit perspective, right? So we're trying to be cures compliant. We're trying to allow technology to drive the capturing of those electronic records. But we do know those are cases where we're going to have to make updates. In those cases, we want to know, again, the details of the change. Who made the change and why? And that's when we get to reason codes and resolution codes. We made an update or a modification to either the regular schedule, the start time and end time, and adjusted time in and time out. The associated reason codes and the resolution codes are defined in the appendix, and we'll map those reasons to those codes and get those sent in. Just helps us, again, track history from a perspective, so if we do get an audit or the state does an audit, we can understand what happened to that visit record. So changes and exceptions are a little bit complicated, so I want to pause there. Ruth, Andrea, questions that rolled in during that review?
Nothing for changes or exceptions yet. A couple of questions on the call type. When would other be used? Do you have any scenarios for that, John?
I don't. We use it as a catch-all bucket. In most cases, other used to apply when, say, a phone wasn't available and because you're in a rural area, or you couldn't even use your mobile phone from an offline perspective, and say the caregiver did a timesheet. We do those as a manual data entry, so we can track that it was manually entered. Other, again, as a catch-all. I can't think of any times where you would use other off the top of my head. Mobile, telephony, manual. FDV is a fixed verification device that allows you to track location through a device that the SANdata system uses. But Garrick, I don't think that you'll ever use other, but if there are scenarios or cases, I'd be interested in hearing those.
And then 2 questions came in, not really specific to this section, but can you just talk through when they're going to be receiving the testing checklist that we provide during our testing phase?
Absolutely. So from a checklist perspective, we're making a couple modifications here at SANdata where we're going to certify the vendor solution adheres to the state's policies and programs. So I know a number of the provider agencies have already reached out and inquired to receive credentials. In early August, we will start to create those credentials. What the SANdata team is, we'll send acknowledgement to the provider that we are starting to engage with your vendor. We've asked for your approval to do that engagement. So we'll reach out to the vendor. What we'll provide them is a checklist, and what the checklist is a series of test cases. There's several on the phone that have been through it with other programs. It's going to modify that checklist a little bit, but what it's geared for is we're going to certify the solution rather than the individual agencies. Once the vendor solution has been certified, we'll send a communication to each of the agencies using that system so that we can more quickly onboard you and move you into a production state where your vendor of choice is sending visits on your behalf. It decreases the amount of work that each of the agencies has to do. It hopefully streamlines the process for the vendors, but also increases program adherence as we move forward. So we know we want to get the majority of vendors on and approved and all the agencies working towards that October 1st deadline. So we'll engage there. So it's kind of a 2-step process. We're going to put out some more communications around that on how it specifically affects you. But those that have already engaged, you should have received a reply requesting some vendor information as well as your agency ID. Again, we'll engage at the vendor level to get vendor certification as an EVV platform for the Arizona Go Live. And then we will push people towards the production soft go live date, October 1st or 3rd. Ruth, keep me honest there.
Yeah, October 5th is when we start provider training. Yep. Let's see. Just going to do a time check here. About 10 minutes left or so. John, how much further have we got to get through?
Just tasks. Last section of tasks.
Okay, cool. Let's go ahead and get through that, and then we can maybe take some one-off questions.
Yep. So task ID, we have an optional segment. If you collect tasks in the field, we do want to know those so that we know what specific procedures or what specific items are being collected in the field. All we're looking for is the task ID. Task ID is matched to Appendix 7. And then if you did meal preparation was the task for the day and the client or member that received service refused that, we're just looking for a yes/no indicator. Optional. It may not be collected at the time, but again, if you do collect tasks, which I believe are in scope for the program, we want to know the tasks that were completed for that particular visit. IDs match. They're pretty generic in general and should match to any of the medical necessity needs information that you're collecting on your side. So I'll pause there, Ruth.
Yep. Leslie Zimmer had a good question. The test segment documentation states that these are both conditional and optional.
Yeah, Leslie, so not all, I know how to state this, so not all procedure codes will have a task. Respite doesn't, I don't believe, specifically has a task associated with it, but some of the home care services do. Meal prep, bathing, things of that nature. So it's really dependent on the service code.
I was just going to say, if you look at that header, it says this is a conditional segment to be provided when tasks are performed during a given visit. One visit record may include multiple task records. This is an optional segment.
Yep.
So that kind of like, I don't know. It just seems a little clear. Yeah.
Yeah. I'll work on the verbiage of that, Leslie, and then we can, when we do our deep dive, we'll talk through that in a little bit more detail. We'll provide that guidance to this larger team as well, so that we can get that around there. But it's really procedure code based. Do you have to collect a task for that specific procedure code? Let me see if I can get some clarifications, and we'll make that a little more clear. Good question, though. Thanks.
And John, we do have a question from Matt D. at Acumen. Matt, go ahead with your question.
Yeah, I'm sorry, guys. I apologize. I meant to ask this a few minutes ago. It's specifically related to client-verified times, client-verified services in the section above. Yeah. Did I hear it correctly that even though those are optional fields, and I know someone asked a question about whether or not, what they send when their system doesn't even have the ability to collect that type of verification, whether it be signature, voice recording, or any other method, you're viewing that, even though those are optional, you're viewing that as an exception, and you want an exception code. So if the client didn't provide that verification or attestation, I believe it was called, that's an exception?
That's correct.
Most of my question there is, a client attestation is not part of the Cures Act directly, right? It's not one of the it's not one of the 7 Cures Act elements. Verification is, I believe, my understanding is it's verification through technology of the start time, the end time, and the location if possible, but client attestation is in there. So my concern there is, the word exception has a little bit of a negative connotation to it. So if the client doesn't attest, but it's a valid EVV, let's say it comes through a mobile app, we have geolocation, it's real time, we know the start and the end time, there's no manual edits to it. It's a good visit.
It's a clean visit.
Yeah. So is there, just because of the negative connotation of the word exception, right? When you're a developer, exceptions are generally a bad thing, right? Is there going to be any thresholds or something that there's going to be, it would trigger an audit and say, hey, you're not getting any client attestations, and if a system doesn't offer a client attestation, the ability to even capture it, everything's an exception at that point, right? And so I'm just curious why it's being viewed as an exception, and if it is an exception, I'm looking at your exceptions appendix, which I believe is Appendix 4. Would that be would we be passing an exception code 40, service verification exception? Is that the expected? So it'd be either 40 or 28 or looks like 39. So that it's one of those options, 40, 28, or 39.
And it could be all three, right? So the client did not certify the service that was provided, didn't verify the visit. The visit verification exception is time in and time out, and client signatures I didn't sign. So from a access perspective and a state-defined program, the client verification is required. So they're looking for the client to verify service received, start and end time, and then sign to that, just as an attestation that the service did occur. And I think Sarah's, sorry, go ahead.
The active signing. So if the client signs, and our system does have the ability to collect this information, so
yeah.
we're not in the boat where we can't get it, but so if the client signs, they're signing off on service start time, service in the times and the service code, right? So if we show them,
That's correct.
this is the visit, it was this employee, they started at this time, they ended at this time for a duration of this amount, providing this service code at this location. Does this look good to you? And they sign. So I guess I would kind of expect that if that's the approach, then we're not going to have a 28 and a 40 as long as we have a signature. The client is attesting to the entire visit and all of its elements. Is that valid?
Yes, I would have to defer to Dara to ensure that that's correct, but that is my understanding, yes.
Okay, so they're not attesting to each element like individually. They're saying, yep, I looked at it. You showed me the general details, specifically, right, what we're really talking about here are the Cures Act elements, right? So really the big seven.
Big seven.
I attest, good to go, and that's, so we wouldn't have, so if we get a signature, we're not going to worry about 40 and 28 because they're not individually attesting to those elements.
Correct. Yes, so if that's the way your solution works, I think that aligns to program definition, yes.
Okay.
We do ours, just for your knowledge, we have those two separate. Service start time and code, they're two different. They can go yes, no, or no, yes, or yes, yes. So we have them split in the database. So if yours is, I'm attesting to the entire visit, which includes procedure code and start and end times, then you would go true, true, true for all three, and you wouldn't throw that exception.
Right, but there's only three, right? Or there's only two. Client.
There's two, right?
Yeah, so we're only
two,
we're going to pass both of those as true, verified times and service.
And then you collected a signature.
Okay. So. Last question, and I apologize, it's kind of complicated, but so signatures and recordings, that's great, right? But our solution offers, multiple options beyond that for attestation. The client can enter, because clients can log into our system as well and view their own data, so they can enter their PIN or password. We offer a picture with facial recognition. So if they do another method of attestation other than signature or voice recording, is that good? Because again, none of these methods of attestation are technically part of the Cures Act, so systems have their own ways of providing attestation, that whatever they came up with on their own, if they viewed attestation as an important component of EVV, is another method other than those two okay? And can we pass this as, yeah, they verified time and they verified service, but they didn't do a signature, they did another method of attestation in our system. Is it okay to pass those two elements as true?
I'll have to defer to Dara, but I believe yes, because it's an alternate method, either login and approval through a portal, facial recognition, whichever ways. The main goal of it is to ensure that the client agrees with the information that was collected or the visit information, and they have quote unquote approved or attested to that visit, that it did occur for that period of time. Ruth, Andrea, let's take that one though, and we'll add it into the FAQ when we talk to Dara and do some more expansion, and just ensure that we capture that one correctly. Outside of voice recording and signature, alternate methods of approval, do those satisfy this requirement?
Okay. We got it. And then Sue Turlock has had her hand raised with a question, and we have about 3 minutes left. So Sue, go ahead and ask your question, and if it's quick, we'll answer it. If not, we'll get to it in the FAQ.
No, that's fine. It should be fairly quick. It goes back up to the client section. So if a patient is in an MCO, they have a policy number with Aetna or Humana or whatever, but they also have a Medicaid ID. So I understand the Medicaid ID will go in the Medicaid ID field. Do you need us to send you the MCO policy number anywhere, or do you map that out with the crosswalk?
No, we're gonna map it on a crosswalk behind the scenes too.
Okay. A couple other states do it that way, but I just wanted to make sure.
Yep. No, if you just send us the access ID, we'll do the crosswalk on the back end.
That's much easier. Thank you.
Anything new that Dara hasn't really addressed in the chat recently? A couple of questions are around tasks and if they're required. Dara just had mentioned that they developed that general list of tasks so that it can fit with most services. Let's see, just trying to scroll through, maybe we can get one more in. And then a few questions came in, a really good wrap-up question. Will a recording of this webinar be available, as well as the last webinar from 2 weeks ago? And then how are these questions going to get generated back into the FAQ? So Dara provided a response there as well, that they are working on providing that FAQ. We're going to be including questions that we couldn't get to on this webinar, as well as just other communications for the past couple of months. And we are recording this webinar. We'll make sure that the state gets a copy of it, and they'll post it to the Access site along with the one that was hosted 2 weeks ago as well. So I think with that, we're going to go ahead and wrap this up. Again, all of these materials will be available soon. We'll work in collaboration with Access to get them posted and collated and responded to. John, thanks so much for talking for the past 2 hours, and thanks everyone that attended today. Really good questions. I'm happy that we could all get together and have a little bit more in-depth technical review and answer specific questions. Anything else? John, Tim, Andrea?
No, I think we're good for today. I think this was productive, and thank you all very much for your active participation. And as John said earlier, please recall that this is the start of the conversation, and we will continue these throughout the course of the testing and the evaluation and certification for this. So as you have more questions and as more arise, we want to make sure we keep this channel open.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Hope you have a great rest of the week, and I'm sure we'll all be talking soon. Bye now.